On July 20th, 1969, history paused. The world's eyes were fixed on a grainy black-and-white screen. Families huddled around televisions, radios hummed with static, and 600 million people waited for one man to step into the unknown. Neil Armstrong climbed down the ladder of the lunar module, his bulky suit moving slowly under 1/6 gravity. His voice, calm but trembling with the weight of the moment, echoed across Earth. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It was supposed to be the most transparent, unbroken broadcast in human history. Every second was meant to be preserved forever. But then, something happened. For nearly 2 minutes, the transmission went dark. The live video cut out, the audio dissolved into static. No heartbeat, no words, no images of humanity's first walk on another world. Just silence. NASA quickly explained it away as a technical issue, a minor loss of signal. Nothing unusual, they insisted. But 2 minutes in the middle of the most important event in human history? Skeptics have never accepted that answer. Because if Armstrong saw something that could not be shown to the public, this was the moment to hide it. Apollo 11. Triumph under pressure. The path to the moon was not smooth. Apollo 11 was not a simple victory march. It was a mission balanced on the edge of failure. When the Saturn V rocket lifted off on July 16, 1969, its roar shook the Earth. Inside were 3 men, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. They were engineers, pilots, and in many ways test subjects in a grand experiment. Every system aboard Apollo had been tested, but nothing like this had ever been attempted. 3 days later, they slipped into lunar orbit. The next challenge was the riskiest of all, the descent. Armstrong and Aldrin entered the lunar module, Eagle, leaving Collins to circle the moon alone in the command module, Columbia. As Eagle detached and began its descent, alarms blared. Error codes 1201 and 1202. No one in mission control had seen them before. For a moment, it looked like the descent might have to be aborted. Armstrong's calm voice cut through the tension. "Give us a reading." Houston responded quickly. The alarms were overloads, not critical failures. The descent continued. But then a new problem appeared. The computer was steering them toward a crater field littered with massive boulders. The autopilot would have landed Eagle in disaster. With seconds ticking away, Armstrong seized manual control. He guided the craft with a pilot's precision, skimming over jagged rocks, searching for a safe patch of ground. The fuel countdown was brutal, 60 seconds, then 30. Controllers in Houston gripped their consoles. At 17 seconds of fuel left, Armstrong touched down. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Cheers erupted in mission control. Engineers wept, strangers embraced, and for a brief moment, the world united. Humanity had achieved the impossible. But inside the cockpit, Armstrong and Aldrin were not celebrating. They were focused. Every move was deliberate, every system double-checked. For them, the landing was not the end. It was the beginning. They had stepped into history, but also into the unknown. It was during this unknown, as Armstrong prepared to exit the lander, that the story turns. This is where the official narrative begins to fracture. When the world was supposed to witness every second, something inexplicable occurred. The silence, the blackout, and the questions that have haunted Apollo 11 ever since. The gaps in history. The moon landing was meant to be the most carefully documented event in human history. Yet when we dig into the details, we do not find a perfectly preserved record. Instead, we find silence, missing evidence, and behavior that raises more questions than answers. The first gap is the most famous: the 2 minutes of silence. For nearly 120 seconds, the live feed from the moon cut out. The world, which had been promised uninterrupted coverage, saw only static. NASA called it a technical issue. Engineers explained it as routine interference. But critics point to the timing. Armstrong and Aldrin were moving into position to explore the area near a crater rim. Was it coincidence that the signal failed at the very moment they had the best vantage point of the lunar horizon? Or was the feed deliberately cut to keep something hidden? Then there are the tapes. NASA recorded the moon landing in high-quality slow-scan video, far clearer than the fuzzy broadcast the world saw. But those original tapes, the most valuable recordings in history, were later erased and reused. NASA's official explanation is that storage was limited and the tapes were recycled. But archivists and historians find that excuse absurd. Billions were spent to reach the moon, yet the evidence of that achievement was treated like an old office file? To many, it looks less like an accident and more like destruction of evidence. Next comes Armstrong himself. While Buzz Aldrin became a public speaker and Michael Collins wrote openly about his orbit around the moon, Armstrong withdrew. He avoided interviews, rarely appeared in public, and when he did, he spoke cryptically. At a White House event years later, he told young students, "Breakthroughs are available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers." To some, this was poetic encouragement. To others, it was a hint. Armstrong carried a truth he could never share. Finally, there is the mystery of Apollo's sudden end. Between 1969 and 1972, 6 missions landed on the moon. Then, without warning, the program was canceled. NASA claimed budgets were the reason. But why abandon the moon, the greatest achievement of human history, after only 3 years? The United States had proven it could land there. Why not build a base, continue exploration, or return regularly? The official answer is cost. The unofficial suspicion is fear. Fear of what might be waiting. These gaps, blackouts, missing tapes, cryptic words, and abandoned missions are not random accidents. Taken together, they paint a picture that does not align with the perfect story we were taught. Something is missing from the history of Apollo 11. Something important. And the deeper we look, the harder it becomes to believe that every gap is just coincidence. The competing stories. Courtroom debate. If Apollo 11 were a courtroom case, the evidence would be laid out in front of a jury. On one side, NASA's official version of events. On the other, a growing body of suspicion fed by silence, missing records, and cryptic remarks. The question is simple. Whose story holds up under cross-examination? NASA's official line. NASA insists there is nothing to hide. The blackout. It was a technical glitch, nothing more. Deep space communication in 1969 was fragile, prone to interference. 2 minutes of static is not evidence of a conspiracy. It is evidence of old technology. The missing tapes. According to NASA, the erasure of the original slow-scan videotapes was a bureaucratic blunder. Storage was limited, and tapes were reused to save money. It was embarrassing, yes, but not sinister. Armstrong's silence. Armstrong was always private, even before Apollo. He was an engineer, not a showman. His avoidance of publicity was consistent with his personality, not proof of a secret. The end of Apollo. The missions were canceled because the Vietnam War drained the U.S. budget and public interest faded. Americans had seen men walk on the moon. The excitement was over. Money and politics, not mystery, killed the program. NASA's story is neat, rational, and supported by facts of the era. It appeals to logic, but does it satisfy? The alternative hypothesis. The other side of the courtroom tells a darker tale. The blackout. Too convenient to be an accident. The timing, exactly when Armstrong and Aldrin had the best view, suggests intentional censorship. A deliberate cut to hide what was unfolding on the lunar surface. The missing tapes. The idea that humanity's greatest recording was casually erased is unbelievable. Billions were spent to get there. Would NASA really recycle history's crown jewel unless there was something dangerous on those tapes? Armstrong's silence. His withdrawal was not shyness, but the burden of secrecy. His cryptic remark about truth's protective layers hints at knowledge locked away. Silence was not a choice. It was an obligation. The end of Apollo. Budget excuses do not explain why America abandoned the moon while still in a Cold War race. The alternative theory is chilling. Apollo missions were halted because astronauts encountered something that warned us off. This story is dramatic, unsettling, and built on connecting dots that NASA prefers left unconnected. The jury's dilemma. So which story do we believe? NASA's account is simple and bureaucratic, but its simplicity can feel too convenient, almost dismissive. Meanwhile, the alternative explanation is messy and speculative, but it answers the haunting question: why do so many gaps exist in the first place? A jury faced with these two cases would struggle. The official story is grounded but unsatisfying. The alternative story is sensational but strangely compelling. And that tension, that unresolved pull between two narratives, is why the mystery of Apollo 11 refuses to die. What might Armstrong have seen? Rumors began almost as soon as Apollo 11 touched down. In Australia, where some of the live signals were received, technicians whispered that Armstrong had switched to a private channel, describing large objects standing silently on the crater's edge. According to their account, he said they were watching them. Were these rocks? Shadows? Or something far more extraordinary? Buzz Aldrin added fuel years later when he admitted that Apollo 11 had been followed by a cylinder-shaped object on the way to the moon. He suggested it was probably rocket debris, but his hesitant tone only raised more questions. Why mention it at all if it was so easily explained? Photographs from later missions deepened the intrigue. Apollo 15 and Apollo 16 returned images of odd, angular shapes on the surface. NASA dismissed them as tricks of light, but to those already suspicious, they looked like ruins, artifacts, structures. Evidence that the moon was not as empty as we had been told. And then, of course, there was Neil Armstrong himself. He never confirmed these stories, but he never crushed them either. Instead, he lived with a silence that felt heavier than words. If the first man on the moon had truly seen something unexplainable, perhaps his only choice was to carry that truth quietly, letting the world wonder. The Cold War and the need for silence. To understand why Apollo 11's unanswered questions still echo, we have to step back into 1969 and remember the world America lived in. The moon landing was not just about exploration. It was about power. It was about proving, beyond all doubt, that the United States was ahead of the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Every image broadcast, every word spoken by Armstrong and Aldrin was part of a geopolitical performance. The United States was not simply landing men on the moon, it was declaring technological supremacy. Against this backdrop, the idea that astronauts might have encountered something unknown, something inexplicable, was not just inconvenient. It was dangerous. Imagine the consequences if Armstrong had said, "Live on air," that massive, unidentified craft were observing them. The reaction would not have been excitement. It would have been panic. Americans already lived under the shadow of nuclear war. The thought that an unknown power might be present on the moon could have destabilized everything. It would have raised questions the government could not answer, questions the Soviet Union could have exploited in propaganda, and questions that might have fractured public trust at the height of America's greatest victory. NASA, after all, was not a purely scientific body. It was an arm of the American state, funded by Congress, overseen by political leaders, and entangled in military priorities. The Apollo program had been born from a challenge issued by John F. Kennedy, not from a laboratory but from a political podium. For NASA to admit something beyond human control, something that did not fit the narrative of triumph, would have been unthinkable. And there was precedent. Just a decade earlier, the U.S. Air Force had quietly run Project Blue Book, collecting thousands of UFO reports. Most were dismissed, but not all. Behind closed doors, military officials acknowledged that some sightings defied explanation. Yet publicly, they denied everything. Secrecy was policy, not the exception. Seen in this light, the mysteries of Apollo 11, blackouts, missing tapes, Armstrong's cryptic words, do not look random at all. They look like the continuation of a pattern: control the story, suppress the unexplained, and protect the image of American dominance. So perhaps the real question is not whether Armstrong saw something on the moon. Perhaps the real question is what the United States government was prepared to do to make sure the world never heard it. From Apollo to today, the mystery resurfaces. For more than 50 years, the Apollo 11 mystery sat like a sealed file. The blackout, the missing tapes, Armstrong's silence, these were fragments whispered about by researchers, debated by enthusiasts, dismissed by skeptics. But in the last few years, those whispers have found new life, and the shadow of Apollo has stretched into our present. In 2023, something remarkable happened. The United States Congress held public hearings on unidentified aerial phenomena, what most of us still call UFOs. Military officers, intelligence officials, and whistleblowers testified under oath. One of them, David Grush, a former intelligence officer, claimed that the U.S. government has long possessed non-human craft. He was not a fringe figure on a late-night radio show. He was speaking in the halls of power. His words entered into the congressional record. Suddenly, the world that had laughed off UFOs was listening. Suddenly, the idea that Armstrong may have seen something on the moon no longer sounded like fantasy. It sounded like a missing chapter in a story that is still unfolding. And then came the James Webb Space Telescope. Designed to look back to the dawn of time, it has also revealed anomalies that defy simple explanation. Among them, objects like 3I Atlas, interstellar visitors racing through our solar system with trajectories and behaviors scientists cannot fully explain. One discovery in particular shook the scientific community, an object whose tail seemed to act like propulsion. Harvard astrophysicists even warned the public that some interstellar bodies may not be natural at all. Think about that. Half a century after Armstrong's quiet step, the most advanced telescope ever built is showing us mysteries that echo the rumors of Apollo. Strange visitors, unexplainable behavior, possibilities that blur the line between science and science fiction. The gap between conspiracy theory and mainstream science is closing. What was once dismissed is now debated in official hearings. What was once rumor is now data on a telescope's chart. And in that shift, the silence of Apollo 11 feels less like wild speculation and more like the first page of a story we are only beginning to read. So perhaps Apollo 11 was not just the dawn of space exploration. Perhaps it was the prologue to an era in which humanity must face a truth it has avoided for decades. That we are not alone, and that our first encounter may have happened not in some distant future, but on the very night humanity first set foot on the moon. So after more than 50 years, the question remains. On that night in 1969, was Neil Armstrong only the first man to walk on the moon, or the first witness to a greater truth? 2 minutes of blackout, lost tapes, a silent astronaut, and a program that ended too soon. These are not just coincidences, but shadows of a story unfinished. Today, Congress admits to unexplained phenomena, whistleblowers speak of non-human craft, and telescopes reveal mysteries like 3I Atlas. Each new revelation makes Apollo's silence harder to ignore. As humanity prepares to return to the moon, the world will no longer accept static as an answer. When the next astronaut looks out across the lunar horizon, will we finally see what Armstrong may have seen, or will the mystery remain carved forever in the dust of Tranquility Base? Armstrong spoke of one giant leap for mankind. Perhaps the real leap was into understanding, a step toward the truth that we are not alone.